After my grandfather's funeral, I kept my mouth shut about the $50 million he had secretly left me. I am so glad I played along because just a week later, the shocking truth his attorney revealed about my parents' past shook me to the core. My name is Madeline, 34 years old, and until recently I thought my family simply misunderstood me. I had just returned from burying the only man who ever truly loved me, my grandfather Theodore, only to find my belongings stuffed into heavy black trash bags on the front porch of our Connecticut estate. My mother Patricia looked me dead in the eye and threw a crumpled $100 bill at my chest, telling me to get out before I ruined their new business ventures. I simply picked up the money and smiled. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The damp evening air chilled me to the bone as I stood on the porch of the sprawling brick mansion I had grown up in. I was still wearing my black morning dress, my heels aching from standing at the cemetery for hours. Yet there they were. 4 industrial trash bags haphazardly tossed against the pristine white columns of the entryway. My name was scrawled on a piece of masking tape attached to the largest bag. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door. The house echoed with the sound of a metal tape measure snapping back into place. I walked up the curved staircase and followed the noise down the hall to my childhood bedroom. The door was wide open. Inside, my 31-year-old sister Caroline was peeling my framed art prints off the walls and tossing them onto the floor. Beside her stood her husband Desmond. Desmond, my 33-year-old African-American brother-in-law, was dressed in a razor-sharp tailored suit that my father had definitely paid for. He was holding a laser measuring tool against the far wall, nodding to himself with deep satisfaction. "Sorry, sis," Desmond sneered without even looking at me. "We are knocking down this wall for my new crypto podcast studio. Go back to that cramped apartment you have been hiding in since your divorce." Caroline brushed her blonde hair over her shoulder and placed a protective hand over her slightly rounded stomach. Her designer diamond rings caught the hallway light. "Do not look so offended, Madeline," she sighed loudly. "Desmond needs a professional space to talk to his high-level investors. You only use this room to sleep when you visit. It is not like you need space for your little logo-making hobby." My hands clenched at my sides. They genuinely believed I was a struggling freelancer scraping by on cheap design gigs. They had absolutely no idea that over the last 4 years, I had built an elite branding and public relations agency from the ground up. My client list included Fortune 500 companies and tech billionaires. But I had kept my success entirely hidden from them, knowing exactly how my family operated. If they knew I had money, they would either demand it or destroy it. I was about to ask them to carefully hand over the rest of my belongings when the sharp clicking of my mother's heels sounded on the hardwood floor behind me. Patricia stepped into the doorway, her face set in a cold, impatient glare. She did not look like a woman who had just buried her father-in-law. She looked like a CEO clearing out dead weight. "We let you stay here to grieve, but the funeral is over," Patricia said, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a crumpled $100 bill, and tossed it directly at my chest. It fluttered to the floor, landing next to my discarded artwork. "Desmond's startup is the future of this family," my mother continued, gesturing proudly toward my brother-in-law, who puffed out his chest. "Caroline is pregnant. She is giving this family an heir. You are 34, divorced, and making logos for pennies. We are tired of supporting your failures. Stop dragging us down and leave." I looked from the crumpled bill on the floor to my mother's icy expression. Before I could respond, heavy footsteps echoed from the hall. My father Richard appeared behind my mother. He was holding a thick manila folder and a silver pen. His face was flushed with a strange, nervous energy. "Good, you are packing," Richard barked, shoving the clipboard into my hands. "Before you call your little Uber, sign this." I glanced down at the document. It was a quitclaim deed and a formal waiver of estate contestation. He was demanding that I legally forfeit any right to challenge Theodore's estate. "Sign it," Richard demanded, tapping the pen aggressively against the paper. "Your grandfather was senile in his final months. He left behind nothing but debts and a mountain of unpaid medical bills. Sign the waiver so I can clear the estate through probate court without any bureaucratic delays from you. I will not have you sniffing around looking for a handout. I read the legal jargon carefully. My father was sweating. Desmond had stopped measuring the wall and was watching me with intense focus. Caroline held her breath. They were too eager. They were pushing too hard. If Theodore had truly died penniless, there would be no need to ambush me with legal waivers mere hours after they lowered him into the ground. I took the silver pen from my father's trembling hand. I knew exactly what they thought of me. They thought I was weak, broken by my divorce, and entirely dependent on their scraps. I signed my name with a smooth, practiced flourish and handed the clipboard back. Good luck with the crypto podcast, Desmond, I said, my voice perfectly level. I picked up the $100 bill, smoothed it out, and placed it neatly on my sister's shoulder. Buy something nice for the baby. I turned my back on their stunned faces, walked down the stairs, and grabbed the trash bags off the porch. The cold rain had started to fall, slicking the driveway as my rideshare pulled up to the gate. I loaded my life into the trunk and slid into the back seat. As the car pulled away from the mansion, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out to see a secure, encrypted message from Mitchell, my grandfather's fiercely loyal attorney. Do not sign any property release forms. The message read, Your grandfather left you $50 million in an offshore trust. Come to my office at midnight. There is a video you need to see about what your parents did to him. The rain pounded against the windshield of the rideshare as I pulled up to the towering glass building in the financial district. It was exactly midnight. The marble lobby was entirely deserted, but Mitchell stood waiting by the security desk. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, and a thick manila folder tucked firmly under his right arm. We rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor in complete silence. He led me down a dark corridor into his corner office and locked the heavy oak door behind us. The only light in the room came from the glow of his computer monitor and the city skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Take a seat, Madeline, he instructed, gesturing to the leather chair opposite his desk. I took the liberty of pouring you a glass of water. You are going to need it. Mitchell clicked his mouse and turned the screen toward me. A video file loaded. My breath hitched in my throat as my grandfather appeared on the screen. Theodore looked frail, sitting in his favorite wingback chair at the nursing home, but his eyes burned with that familiar, sharp intelligence. He looked straight into the camera lens. Madeline, if you are watching this, my fight is over, but yours is just beginning. My grandfather's voice filled the quiet office, carrying a weight that made my hands tremble. For 15 years, I have let Richard and Patricia parade around high society, playing the role of brilliant entrepreneurs. I let them tell you and the rest of the world that my company went bankrupt because I was too old and out of touch to understand modern technology. That was a lie. Richard and Patricia did not build their wealth. They stole it. Mitchell paused the video for a second. He leaned across the desk, his expression grim. Your father was the chief financial officer of your grandfather's original tech firm 15 years ago. Your mother was the legal counsel. Together, they transferred the primary patents for Theodore's software to a shell corporation they controlled. They intentionally crashed the parent company, forced your grandfather into a staged bankruptcy, and walked away with the intellectual property that built their entire manufacturing empire. I stared at the frozen image of my grandfather's face, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. My parents had built their entire identity on being self-made visionaries, while mocking Theodore as a cautionary tale of bad business management. They had constantly reminded me that I needed to respect their financial genius. They built their fortune on his stolen intellect. Mitchell pressed play again. They resented you, Madeline, because every time they looked at you, they saw me. They saw my independence, my refusal to cut corners, my refusal to rely on toxic family dynamics. I spent the last 10 years rebuilding my wealth entirely off the grid through offshore investments they knew nothing about. I generated $50 million. I secured it in a trust with your name on it. Do not give them a single dime. Burn their fake empire to the ground. The video ended. The silence in the office was deafening. $50 million. My grandfather had orchestrated a masterpiece of financial recovery from a nursing home bed while my parents thought he was surviving on their charity. Before I could formulate a sentence to respond, my phone vibrated violently against the glass surface of Mitchell's desk. It was an automated fraud alert from my bank. Then another alert followed from a different credit card company. A third notification popped up indicating my primary checking account had been frozen due to suspicious activity. My blood ran cold as I opened my banking app. Every single personal account showed a zero balance with a red lock icon flashing at the top of the screen. A text message banner dropped down from the top of my phone. It was from Desmond. "Check your account, sis. I told you I have friends at the bank. Richard authorized a freeze on all your assets linked to the family management group. Sign the property release waiver I sent to your email and I will make sure you can buy groceries tomorrow. Do not try to fight the family." I shoved the phone across the desk toward Mitchell. "They are freezing my personal accounts right now. Desmond is using my father's banking connections to lock me out of my own money. They actually believe I am some starving freelancer who will break the second I cannot buy a coffee. They think freezing my personal cards will force me to sign away my rights to whatever they think Theodore left behind. Desmond is sitting in my childhood bedroom right now, playing the big-shot crypto investor with my father's money trying to starve me out." Mitchell did not look surprised. He reached into his manila folder and pulled out a stack of documents bound by a thick legal seal. "Let them play their petty games with your checking accounts," he said, sliding the heavy stack across the desk. "These are the control documents for the offshore trust. As of this exact moment, you have $50 million in completely untraceable, unfreezable liquid assets at your disposal. You hold the ultimate financial weapon." I touched the thick paper, feeling the power of my grandfather's final gift transferring into my hands. "I can crush them with this. I can buy out their debt. I can ruin Desmond's fraudulent crypto business before he even launches his next podcast." Mitchell placed his hand flat over the document, stopping my celebration. "You have the $50 million, Madeline. But look at this." He turned his computer monitor back around and opened a fresh legal filing that had just hit the county probate system. The digital stamp showed it was filed exactly 30 minutes ago. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes catching on my father's name as the petitioner. "Your father is not just trying to starve you out," Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "He just filed a competing will in probate court, a document supposedly signed by Theodore yesterday. It leaves everything your grandfather owned, including any hidden assets, directly to Caroline's unborn baby. They are using an unborn child to bypass you completely." A few hours later, the morning sun glared off the windshield as I drove my rented sedan through the wrought iron gates of the Oak Bridge Country Club. The lush green fairways and pristine white clubhouse stood as a monument to everything my parents valued: status, appearances, power. I tossed my keys to the valet, ignoring his questioning look at my modest car, and walked straight up the marble steps. Mitchell had worked through the night to process the initial trust transfers, giving me exactly the ammunition I needed. I spotted them immediately on the outdoor sunlit terrace. Richard, Patricia, Caroline, and Desmond were seated at the best table overlooking the 18th hole, clinking crystal champagne flutes. They were celebrating their grand theft, entirely unaware that the game had already changed. I marched across the terrace with purpose. The sharp click of my heels drew the attention of several wealthy club members seated at nearby tables. Patricia noticed me first. Her celebratory smile instantly morphed into a mask of exaggerated pity. She raised her voice, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear every single word. "Look who decided to show up in yesterday's cheap clothes," Patricia announced, gesturing dismissively at my simple black dress. "I told you all, she has been unstable since the divorce. She just completely lost her grip on reality. It is so tragic watching her spiral like this when we have given her every opportunity." Caroline leaned into Desmond, shaking her head with a theatrical sigh. "We tried to help her," Caroline said loudly to a passing waiter. "But you cannot help someone who refuses to work a real job and insists on playing the victim." Desmond adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, shooting me a predatory grin. "Take a seat, Madeline. You look like you need a free meal. The blatant humiliation was a calculated tactic. They wanted me to scream to cry to prove Patricia's claim that I was hysterical in front of their high society friends. I pulled out a chair and sat down, keeping my expression entirely blank. Richard did not bother with pleasantries. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stapled legal document, sliding it across the pristine white tablecloth. It stopped right next to my water glass. "This is a waiver of contestation," Richard said, his voice dropping to a harsh, demanding register. "It legally states that you accept your grandfather's final will, leaving his entire estate to Caroline's unborn baby. You will not challenge it in probate court. You will not request an audit. You will walk away quietly and let the adults handle the family business." I looked down at the forged document. "And if I refuse," I asked evenly. Desmond leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "If you refuse, your bank accounts stay frozen. The fraud department takes these investigations very seriously, sis. It could take months to clear your name. Sign the paper right now and I will make a quick call to my guys at the bank. They will clear the hold by noon. Do not be stupid. Sign it, or you will not even be able to afford groceries by tomorrow." "You really think a forged signature on a fake will is going to hold up in court?" I asked. Richard laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "I have 3 witnesses who will testify." Theodore signed it willingly. "I have the best probate lawyers in the state on retainer. You have a frozen checking account and a failing freelance hobby. You cannot afford to fight me, Madeline. Sign the document. Take the $10,000 I am offering as a courtesy and go back to your miserable little life." I did not reach for the pen. I let the silence stretch for a moment, watching their smug faces. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. Patricia rolled her eyes. "Who are you calling a hotline for failed designers?" I ignored her, dialing a number Mitchell had given me just an hour ago. Desmond scoffed and waved his hand at a passing staff member. "Mr. Jenkins." Desmond called out to the club manager, a stiff man in a tailored suit who immediately hurried over to our table. "My sister-in-law is causing a disturbance. We need her escorted off the property immediately." Mr. Jenkins gave me an apologetic but firm look. "Miss, I am going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private club and your family has requested privacy." I held up a finger to Mr. Jenkins, signaling him to wait. The person on the other end of the line answered. "Yes, the transaction is completely finalized," the voice confirmed. I handed my phone directly to Mr. Jenkins. "This is for you," I said. Jenkins hesitated, then took the phone. "Hello?" he said cautiously. I watched his face closely. Within seconds, the blood completely drained from his cheeks. His posture went entirely rigid. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir. Absolutely, sir." He handed the phone back to me with trembling hands. Richard glared at the manager. "Jenkins, what is going on? Throw her out right now." Mr. Jenkins looked at my father, terrified. "I am sorry, Richard, but I cannot do that." I picked up my phone and slipped it back into my purse. "You see, Dad, while you were busy forging documents and freezing my checking account to starve me out, I was having a very productive morning with Mitchell. Theodore's offshore trust was fully activated at dawn." I smiled, letting the reality wash over them. "I just used a fraction of my $50 million to buy the holding company that owns the Oakbridge Country Club. I own the golf course, I own the dining hall, I own the chair you are sitting on." Caroline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Desmond's smug grin vanished instantly. Patricia stared at me as if I had grown a second head. "That is impossible," Richard sputtered, his face turning an angry shade of red. "You do not have that kind of money. You are lying." "You can check public records by the end of the business day," I said casually. "But right now we have a more pressing matter." I turned my attention back to the manager. "Mr. Jenkins, please officially revoke the memberships of Richard, Patricia, Caroline, and Desmond. They are no longer welcome on my property." Jenkins swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Richard slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. "You cannot do this to us. We have been members here for 20 years. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my black dress. "I just did. You have exactly 3 minutes to finish your champagne before security physically removes you from my club. I suggest you hurry. Desmond will need to save his energy to figure out how to pay back the money he embezzled from your company. Have a wonderful brunch. I turned on my heel and walked away, the sound of my father shouting my name fading into the background. By the time my private car pulled up to my Manhattan apartment building, my phone was vibrating continuously against the leather seat. I glanced at the glowing screen to see 50 new notifications, then 100, then 500. Caroline had not wasted a single second. Furious and humiliated in front of her precious country club audience, she immediately weaponized her favorite tool. I opened social media to find a freshly posted video of my sister weeping perfectly manicured tears. She rubbed her pregnant belly for maximum sympathy and stared tragically into the camera lens. In a trembling voice, she told her followers that I had abandoned our dying grandfather in his final hours. She claimed I was a greedy, unstable outcast who had just brutally evicted our grieving family from a public restaurant out of pure spite. The comment section was a tidal wave of vitriol from strangers calling me a monster, a gold digger, and a disgrace to my family. Before I could even close the application, a direct text message popped up over the flood of hate comments. It was from Desmond. I have 500,000 loyal followers, Madeline, the message read. Sign the estate waiver right now, or I will turn every single one of my crypto investors loose on that little PR startup of yours. We will tank your online reviews by morning. You will be completely out of business before the week is over. Do not test me. I stared at the threatening message and let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed in the quiet car. Desmond truly believed I was running some desperate two-person operation out of a rented basement. He had absolutely no idea that my agency routinely scrubbed global financial scandals for tech billionaires and international politicians. 500,000 aggressive internet bullies were absolutely nothing compared to the algorithmic control my elite team wielded before breakfast. He wanted to play a digital numbers game. I decided it was time to show him how the professionals played. I walked into my high-security office building early the next morning and bypassed my luxury corner suite entirely. I took the private elevator straight down to the secured basement level where my data analytics and cybersecurity team operated. I dropped my phone onto the sleek glass desk of my lead analyst, Marcus. My brother-in-law just threatened to destroy my company, I said, pointing at Desmond's arrogant text message. I want a complete audit of his entire digital footprint. Tear his crypto business apart down to the very last blockchain transaction. Find out exactly how a man who has never held a legitimate job in his life is supposedly funding a fleet of luxury cars and a mansion. It did not even take them 24 hours. By early Tuesday afternoon, Marcus walked into my office and handed me a thick encrypted tablet. You are going to want to sit down for this, Marcus said, his voice completely deadpan. Desmond's crypto token is a complete illusion. It is a digital shell game running on empty servers. But that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is how he is paying out his early investors to keep the entire Ponzi scheme from collapsing. Marcus tapped the screen, bringing up a series of heavily routed bank transfers, hidden behind layers of corporate jargon. Desmond has a backdoor access point into your father's corporate manufacturing accounts. Over the last 14 months, Desmond has quietly embezzled exactly $15 million from Richard's operational budget and funneled it directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to cover his massive crypto losses. My father's company was bleeding cash rapidly, and his golden son-in-law was the one holding the knife. Richard had been so eager to impress Desmond that he handed him the keys to the vault. The intercom on my desk buzzed sharply, interrupting my thoughts. My receptionist sounded slightly panicked. Madeline, there is a woman in the lobby demanding to see you immediately. She says she is your mother, and she is threatening to call the police if I do not let her back there. I smiled. I kept a modest, unassuming decoy reception area on the second floor, specifically for uninvited guests, aggressive paparazzi, or hostile corporate spies. It looked exactly like the struggling low-budget startup my family assumed I ran. Send her in, I instructed, grabbing the printed financial dossiers Marcus had just given me. Patricia marched through the frosted glass doors looking entirely out of place. She wore a pristine Chanel suit and carried her designer purse like a weapon. She surveyed the small, intentionally plain room with absolute disgust, wrinkling her nose as if the air itself was beneath her standards. She did not bother to sit down. She simply marched right up to the desk, unclasped her bag, and pulled out a crisp cashier's check. She slapped it down on the desk with a sharp, echoing smack. "Let us stop this ridiculous temper tantrum right now," Patricia demanded, her voice tight with artificial patience. "Your father is absolutely furious about your little stunt at the club yesterday, but I convinced him to be reasonable. Here is $10,000. It is more than enough to clear your personal debts and keep this miserable little office afloat for another month. Take the money, sign the estate waiver abandoning your claim, and we will pretend your embarrassing outburst never happened. You can go back to your quiet life and leave us in peace." I looked down at the $10,000 check, then looked up at my mother's deeply condescending face. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the anger boiling inside me. I simply picked up the check, tore it precisely in half, and let the pieces flutter gently into the metal trash can beside my desk. Then I reached for the thick financial dossier Marcus had prepared and slid it slowly across the desk until it bumped against my mother's manicured hands. "I do not want $10,000, Mother," I said, my tone freezing the air between us. "I want to know why Dad's company is quietly bleeding $15 million into Desmond's offshore accounts." The heavy oak doors of the probate courtroom swung shut, sealing us inside. 2 weeks had passed since my mother fled my decoy office lobby, completely terrified by the financial dossier I had slid across my desk. My family had not dropped the forged will. In fact, Richard had doubled down. He hired Arthur Vance, the most ruthless and expensive probate litigator in Connecticut, to publicly crush me today. I sat quietly beside Mitchell at the defendant's table. Across the aisle, my family looked like a perfect grieving portrait carefully arranged for a magazine cover. Richard wore a somber, impeccably tailored navy suit. Patricia sat directly behind him, with her head bowed, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch. Desmond kept his eyes glued to his phone, sweating slightly under his stiff collar, likely still trying to figure out how I knew about his offshore accounts. Arthur Vance stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a supremely arrogant smirk. He marched toward the bench and handed a single document to the judge. "Your Honor, we present the final legally binding last will and testament of Theodore Wilson, signed and witnessed just 3 days before his tragic passing. In this document, Theodore clearly outlines his extreme disappointment in his estranged granddaughter, Madeline. He revokes all prior trusts and leaves the entirety of his estate to his devoted granddaughter, Caroline, and her unborn child." Vance turned and called Caroline to the stand. My sister walked up the wooden steps with slow, deliberate fragility. She placed her hand protectively over her pregnant belly, making absolutely sure the judge noticed her maternal state. She placed her other hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and almost immediately began to cry. It was a masterful, sickening performance. Caroline dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a lace tissue. Grandpa Theodore was so terribly lonely in that nursing home, she sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I went to see him every single afternoon. I brushed his hair. I read him the newspaper. He would just cry and ask why Madeline never came to visit him. He was heartbroken by her absence." Vance fed her sympathetic leading questions, allowing her to paint a vivid picture of a dying man, abandoned by a heartless, career-obsessed granddaughter. Caroline spun specific, completely fabricated memories of holding Theodore's hand while he wept about my selfishness. "He told me Madeline only cared about money." Caroline continued, looking bravely at the judge. "He signed this will right in front of me and Desmond. He said he wanted his legacy to go to a real family, to my baby, not to someone who threw him away when he got sick." I watched her lie under oath without flinching. My parents nodded along in the gallery, playing the supportive, devastated audience. They were trying to publicly humiliate me into a corner, establishing a legal record of my alleged negligence to justify the sudden appearance of the forged signature. They wanted to make me look so irredeemable that no judge would ever question why Theodore cut me out. Vance sat down, looking incredibly smug. Mitchell adjusted his glasses, picked up a thick stack of papers from our table, and walked calmly toward the witness stand. "That is a beautifully told story," Caroline Mitchell said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "You claim you were his primary caretaker, his only regular visitor, and his sole emotional support during his final 10 months at the Oak Creek Care Facility." "Yes," Caroline sniffled, lifting her chin defensively. "I was the only one who cared enough to show up." Mitchell pulled the top document from his stack and handed it to the bailiff to pass to the judge. "Then I am incredibly confused by these financial records," Mitchell said smoothly, pacing in front of the stand. "Oak Creek Care Facility costs roughly $20,000 a month for the specialized round-the-clock end-of-life care Theodore required. If you and your husband were his devoted caretakers managing his daily affairs, why did Oak Creek issue 3 separate eviction notices for non-payment during those exact months?" Caroline's face flushed a deep blotchy red. She looked quickly at Richard, who suddenly sat up very straight in his leather chair. "My father handled the finances," Caroline stammered, gripping the wooden edge of the witness stand. "There must have been a banking error. The facility made a mistake." "But there was no error," Mitchell replied, stepping closer and raising his voice so the entire courtroom could hear. "The account linked to your father's company declined every single charge for Theodore's medical care. In fact, Theodore was 24 hours away from being thrown out onto the street. But the eviction never happened. The balance was suddenly paid in full. A lump sum of $200,000 was wired directly to the facility by an anonymous corporate LLC." Vance jumped out of his chair, his arrogant smirk completely vanishing. "Objection, Your Honor. This has absolutely nothing to do with the validity of the signed will." "It has everything to do with it," Mitchell countered sharply, turning to face my family. "Because I have the incorporation documents for that anonymous LLC right here in my hand." Mitchell walked back to our table and picked up a single sheet of paper stamped with a gold seal. He read it aloud. "The sole proprietor and managing director of the LLC that saved Theodore from being thrown into a state-run ward is Madeline. She paid every single medical bill, covered his private nurses, and funded his specialized treatments out of her own pocket, while you and your family let his accounts bounce and left him to face eviction." A collective gasp rippled through the small gallery. Caroline's mouth hung open. She stared at me, the fragile victim facade completely shattering into pieces. Patricia gripped the edge of the wooden pew so hard her knuckles turned stark white. They had genuinely believed I was broke. They had no idea I had the capital to casually drop $200,000 to protect my grandfather from their calculated financial neglect. Mitchell did not give them a single second to recover. He turned back to the judge, his voice commanding absolute authority in the quiet room. "Your Honor, the defense claims Theodore signed this new will willingly in his room on October 12th. Given the blatant financial neglect by the petitioners, Caroline's documented perjury today, and Madeline's proven role as his sole financial provider, we have reason to believe this document is a complete fabrication. Therefore, I am formally requesting an emergency court subpoena for the Oak Creek Care Facility's internal security footage for the hallway outside Theodore's room on the exact date in question." The air in the courtroom instantly vanished. Richard's expensive silver pen snapped in half in his hand, spilling black ink across his tailored trousers. Desmond shot up from his seat in the gallery, his face draining of all color, looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. The sharp crack of the judge slamming his wooden gavel cut through the heavy silence of the courtroom. He ordered an immediate 30-minute recess to review Mitchell's subpoena request in his private chambers. I watched my father frantically whispering to his high-priced lawyer while my mother wiped away non-existent sweat from her forehead. I smoothed the front of my dress, turned, and walked out through the heavy double doors into the expansive marble hallway of the courthouse. I barely made it 10 steps toward the water fountain when a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder, spinning me around violently. I stumbled back against the cold stone wall. Desmond stepped directly into my personal space, trapping me. He placed one hand on the wall beside my head, his tall frame looming over me. He smelled of expensive cologne and sour, nervous sweat. "You really think you are so smart?" "Madeline," Desmond sneered. His voice was a harsh, venomous whisper. You think bringing up those medical bills makes you some kind of hero? You think asking for that security footage is going to magically send us to jail and hand you the keys to the castle? I kept my chin leveled, refusing to shrink away from him. I do not think anything, Desmond. I know exactly what you and my sister did in that nursing home room. And soon the judge will know too. Desmond let out a low, guttural laugh that made my stomach turn. He leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his breath on my cheek. There is no footage, he hissed. I paid the night shift security guard at Oak Creek 10 grand in untraceable cash yesterday evening to completely wipe their main servers. I stood right there and watched him delete the entire month of October. The hard drives are wiped clean. You have absolutely nothing on us. We own this family and we own your precious grandfather's money. Before I could process his blatant confession of tampering with evidence, the sharp clicking of dress shoes echoed down the hallway. My father marched toward us, flanked by my mother and a highly agitated Caroline. Richard's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He did not bother telling Desmond to back away. Instead, he stepped right up next to him, forming a physical wall of intimidation. "You have humiliated me for the absolute last time," Richard growled, pulling his custom smartphone from his breast pocket. "You want to play aggressive corporate warfare with me, Madeline? You want to ruin our public image with these insane allegations about medical bills and stolen patents. Let me show you what real power looks like." My father unlocked his phone and tapped a contact name. "I know exactly who your clients are." He continued, staring me down. "I sit on the executive board of the Sterling Logistics Group. They are your second biggest public relations client. They pay your little agency a massive retainer every single month." He pressed the phone to his ear. A moment later, he spoke into the receiver. "Yes, Arthur. It is Richard. I need a personal favor. Your company is currently utilizing Madeline Wilson's PR agency. I need you to sever that contract immediately. Yes, effective today. She has become a severe liability to my family, and I will not have my associates doing business with her. Thank you, Arthur." Richard ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He looked at me with a triumphant, malicious glare. "I will make one call like that every 10 minutes until your entire agency is blacklisted across the entire state of Connecticut. You will not be able to secure a contract to market a lemonade stand by the time I am finished with you." My phone vibrated heavily in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. An email notification flashed at the very top. It was from the Chief Operations Officer of Sterling Logistics. The subject line read, "Immediate termination of services." Patricia stepped forward, crossing her arms over her pristine designer blazer. She looked down at my phone screen and smiled a sickeningly sweet smile. "Your father warned you, Madeline. We tried to be reasonable at the country club. We offered you a very generous $10,000 settlement to just walk away and let the adults handle the estate. But you had to throw a tantrum. Drop the case right now. Tell the judge you were mistaken about the medical bills. Withdraw your claim, or your father will destroy everything you have built." Caroline waddled forward, resting her hands on her pregnant belly. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "You are a high school dropout playing businesswoman." Caroline smirked. "You have been a failure since the day you left this family. You really thought you could outsmart Dad and Desmond. You are out of your league. Give up and go home before you end up completely bankrupt." I looked at my sister, then at my mother, then at my father, and finally at Desmond, who was still leaning against the wall with that arrogant, victorious grin plastered across his face. They truly believed they had won. They believed that losing a single PR contract would break me. They believed that wiping a local server would erase their crimes. I did not beg. I did not cry. I simply smiled, reached into the side pocket of my blazer, and pulled out my second phone. The screen was brightly lit. The red recording application icon was blinking steadily in the center of the display. The timer showed it had been recording for the last 12 minutes. I held the phone up so the bright screen reflected in Desmond's widening eyes. "Thank you for the confession, Desmond," I said, my voice cutting through the hallway like shattered glass. "I really appreciate you detailing exactly how much you paid the guard to destroy evidence. But you forgot one crucial thing about modern commercial security systems. I took a step forward, forcing Desmond to back away from me. The cameras at Oak Creek do not just save to a physical hard drive in the basement. They instantly back up to a secured off-site cloud server operated by a third-party tech firm. The firm I hired to upgrade the nursing home's security grid 3 months ago. You did not wipe the footage. You just gave me a recorded confession of felony tampering. The judge did not take kindly to the revelation of a deleted security server. Within an hour of hearing the audio recording, he slammed his gavel down and postponed the probate hearing for 2 weeks pending a full forensic investigation into the Oak Creek Care Facility. Richard and Desmond were ordered not to surrender their passports and remain in the state. As I walked out of the courthouse, the look of sheer panic on my father's face was deeply satisfying. But a cornered animal is always the most dangerous, and my family was no exception. By the time I reached my actual office in downtown Manhattan the next morning, the retaliatory strike had already landed. My lead accounts manager, Sarah, was waiting at my desk with a thick stack of printed emails. She looked exhausted. Richard had made good on his threat. He spent the entire night calling every corporate board member, golf buddy, and country club associate in his extensive network. He spun a narrative that I was under federal investigation for elder abuse and corporate espionage. 3 of our mid-level clients pulled their contracts by dawn. Sterling Logistics. My second biggest account officially sent their termination papers at 9 o'clock. The agency had just taken a massive financial hit, losing nearly 40% of our projected quarterly revenue in a single morning. Sarah paced nervously in front of my desk, asking if we needed to downsize the tech team to cover the sudden payroll deficit. I took the stack of termination emails and dropped them straight into the industrial shredder by the window. I told her to give the entire staff a 10% bonus for their hard work and to redirect their focus entirely to the Wilson Manufacturing corporate structure. I was not going to play defense. Let my father think he was winning the public battle. I had a much larger war to wage. Late that evening, the neon sign of a deserted diner buzzed loudly against the pouring rain. I sat in a back booth across from Mitchell. He slid a mug of black coffee across the cracked laminate table and watched me carefully. "My father is trying to bleed my agency dry," I said, stirring the black liquid. "He thinks if he cuts off my cash flow, I will have no choice but to settle before the 2-week extension is up." Mitchell took a slow sip from his mug. "Your father has always been a brute force operator. He attacks the front gates because he lacks the intelligence to find the side door. That is exactly how he stole your grandfather's patents 15 years ago." Mitchell pulled a worn leather notebook from his briefcase and opened it on the table. He showed me a series of ancient, hand-drawn flowcharts. Theodore did not survive that theft by fighting Richard in open court. Mitchell explained, his voice low over the sound of the rain. When Richard and Patricia forced him into fake bankruptcy, Theodore knew he could not win a public war against his own stolen fortune. So he struck from the shadows. He used proxy firms to buy the very supply chains Richard relied on. He controlled the raw materials Richard needed to build his empire. Theodore let your father think he was the king, while Theodore quietly owned the ground he walked on. Your father relies on brute force. Your grandfather relied on leverage. I stared at the faded ink on the notebook pages. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Theodore had left me the $50 million, but he had also left me a blueprint. I looked up at Mitchell. "How much debt is Wilson Manufacturing currently carrying?" Mitchell smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that completely transformed his mild-mannered appearance. "I was hoping you would ask that. Richard's company has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years to cover Desmond's constant crypto losses and Caroline's lavish lifestyle. The company currently holds $20 million in distressed corporate bonds. They are heavily leveraged with a private equity firm in Boston. The debt is high risk, and the firm has been quietly looking to offload it for months to clear their books." I did not hesitate for a single second. I pulled out my secure tablet and accessed the offshore trust interface. "Contact the Boston firm immediately," I instructed, tapping the transfer authorization protocols on my screen. Create a blind proxy LLC registered in Delaware. Use $20 million from the trust and purchase every single ounce of my father's corporate debt. Do it quietly. I want it finalized before the market opens tomorrow. Mitchell closed his notebook and slid it back into his briefcase. By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, you will technically own 80% of your father's corporate liabilities. You will be his primary creditor. If he misses a single payment, you have the legal authority to seize his assets, liquidate his manufacturing plants, and foreclose on his Connecticut estate. Over the next 48 hours, my team worked relentlessly in absolute secrecy. The purchase of the distressed debt went completely unnoticed by Richard. He was far too busy celebrating the loss of my PR clients, fully believing his smear campaign was successfully driving me into the ground. He thought he was watching me drown, entirely unaware that the water he was standing in was rising around his own neck. On Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing the final transfer deeds for the debt purchase when a high-priority red alert flashed across my computer screen. Marcus, my lead cybersecurity analyst, had flagged a massive financial movement inside the Wilson manufacturing network. I opened the secure portal and watched the live data stream. My blood ran cold, followed instantly by a surge of pure adrenaline. Richard, desperate to generate a massive influx of cash to cover the upcoming quarterly payments on the very debt I now owned, had just made a fatal, unrecoverable mistake. The data showed that my father had just completely liquidated his company's remaining cash reserves. Every single operational fund, every payroll account, and every emergency safety net had been emptied. The money, $15 million in total, was actively being wired into an untraceable offshore account managed by Desmond. They were using the last of the company's lifeblood to launch a massive new crypto token, hoping to scam enough investors to save their sinking ship. They had no idea that they were officially insolvent. They had no idea that they had just defaulted on their operational covenants by moving those protected funds. And they had absolutely no idea that the person holding the execution switch to their entire empire was me. They were walking blindly into a trap from which there was zero escape. A heavy cream envelope arrived at my decoy office exactly 3 days later. The gold wax seal bore the Wilson family crest. Inside was an embossed invitation to Patricia's annual Thanksgiving gala. This was not a warm holiday gathering. It was a calculated high society spectacle designed to project an illusion of extreme wealth and unshakable stability. I knew exactly what they were doing. With Richard's corporate accounts secretly drained and his manufacturing company functionally insolvent, this gala was a desperate last-minute fundraising mission. They were going to use the holiday goodwill to pitch Desmond's fraudulent crypto token to Connecticut's wealthiest investors, hoping to secure enough fresh capital to cover their tracks before the banks noticed the missing $15 million. A small handwritten note dropped from the envelope. The elegant calligraphy belonged to my mother. "Madeline, you may come provided you sit at the overflow table and apologize to your sister in front of our guests. We expect you to act like an adult and support Desmond's new venture. Do not embarrass us again." I stared at the thick cardstock, feeling a cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. They were inviting the executioner right into the throne room, entirely convinced I was still just the disgraced outcast. I picked up my pen and checked the box marked "Joyfully Attending." I spent the next week meticulously arranging the final dominoes. Desmond and Richard were moving fast, frantically setting up digital wallets and printing glossy brochures for a cryptocurrency that was backed by absolutely nothing but stolen corporate funds. The token, arrogantly named Apex Coin, was nothing more than a digital vacuum designed to suck up legitimate cash and convert it into untraceable offshore assets. I did not interfere with their marketing. I simply let them build their glass house higher. Instead of playing defense, I focused entirely on the logistics of the gala itself. Patricia always insisted on hiring the same premier catering company, Le Petit Chien, for her massive events. It was a symbol of extreme status, a way to signal to her guests that no expense was spared. I called Mitchell and directed him to open another line of credit from my grandfather's trust. Within 48 hours, I quietly purchased the entire catering conglomerate through a blind proxy firm. I became their sole owner before Patricia had even finalized her roasted pheasant menu. I immediately placed a call to my closest ally in the culinary world, Chef Anton. He was a brilliant, no-nonsense professional whose own independent restaurant I had secretly funded years ago. I installed him as the temporary head chef for the Wilson Thanksgiving Gala. I gave Anton extremely specific instructions. He was not just there to cook a turkey. He and his hand-picked staff were my eyes and ears. They controlled the flow of the evening, the timing of the courses, and the access to the estate's private rooms. His waitstaff were briefed on exactly which target investors to monitor. I now owned the very infrastructure of their grand performance. Thanksgiving morning broke crisp and bitterly cold. I sat in my penthouse, completely ignoring the traditional holiday festivities happening down in the city streets below. I was reviewing the guest list Anton had covertly photographed and sent to me from the estate's kitchen. The names read like a master list of regional banking, private equity, and local politics. Richard and Desmond had invited exactly the kind of powerful people who would ruin them permanently once the fraud was exposed. I stood up and walked to my closet to prepare for the evening. I pulled out a sleek, tailored emerald green gown. It was sharp, elegant, and projected absolute untouchable power. This was not a dress for sitting quietly at an overflow table. It was armor for a total demolition. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just hours before I was scheduled to arrive at the estate, my secure laptop chimed with a high-priority notification. It was a heavily encrypted file transfer from the third-party cybersecurity firm managing the Oak Creek Care Facility servers. The data recovery process was finally complete. The deleted October footage had been fully restored from the cloud backup. I sat down at my desk, my pulse suddenly drumming a rapid rhythm against my ribs. I downloaded the massive video file, entered my decryption key, and pressed play. The grainy black and white security footage filled my screen. The timestamp glowed brightly in the bottom corner, displaying the exact date and time Theodore supposedly signed his new will. I watched as the hallway outside my grandfather's room remained completely empty for 20 minutes. Then the elevator doors at the far end of the hall slid open. Richard, Desmond, and Caroline stepped out. They were not carrying flowers or smiling. They moved with aggressive, rigid purpose. I watched as my father handed the night shift nurse a thick manila envelope, prompting her to quickly abandon her station and walk in the opposite direction. The three of them entered Theodore's room and closed the heavy door behind them. I rapidly switched the camera view to the internal room monitor, a secondary lens the facility had installed for high-risk patient safety. As the video continued to play, all the warmth completely drained from my body. My blood ran absolute ice. My hands began to shake uncontrollably over the keyboard. I was not just watching a forgery. I was watching my father and brother-in-law physically force a dying man's hand onto a piece of paper. Theodore was incredibly frail, hooked up to oxygen, his eyes wide with confusion and terror. Richard grabbed my grandfather's thin wrist, twisting it sharply, while Desmond shoved a pen between Theodore's trembling fingers. I watched Caroline stand idly by, casually checking her phone, while Theodore visibly struggled and wept. I was watching elder abuse, extortion, and assault, all perfectly captured in high-definition digital video. I slammed the laptop shut, unable to watch another second of my grandfather's terror. The calculated patience inside me mutated from a slow burn into a blinding, white-hot inferno. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Mitchell's private line. He answered on the first ring. "I have the recovered footage," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying dead calm. "What does it show?" Mitchell asked cautiously. "It shows that civil court is no longer sufficient," I replied. "Call the FBI. Tell them to be at my parents' estate at 8 o'clock tonight." I ended the call with Mitchell and slipped the phone into my evening bag. The digital clock on the dashboard of my chauffeured Maybach read 7 o'clock. I had exactly 1 hour before the federal agents breached the perimeter of my family's fortress. The drive through the winding, snow-dusted roads of Fairfield County felt entirely different tonight. I was no longer the discarded daughter returning to beg for scraps. I was the architect of their total destruction. The estate was ablaze with golden light. A fleet of luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway, and a small army of valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open doors for Connecticut's financial elite. I instructed my driver to bypass the valet queue entirely and pull directly up to the grand marble steps. The heavy car glided to a halt. The driver opened my door, and I stepped out into the biting November air. The emerald green silk of my custom gown pooled elegantly around my heels, catching the glow of the massive crystal chandelier hanging in the foyer. I walked up the steps with my head held high. The heavy oak doors stood wide open, welcoming a steady stream of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and politicians. Patricia was holding court in the grand entryway, dripping in diamonds and sipping champagne. The moment her eyes landed on me, her practiced high society smile instantly curdled into a mask of pure panic and rage. She abruptly excused herself from the mayor's wife and marched directly into my path, physically blocking me from stepping any further into the house. "What do you think you are doing?" Patricia hissed, keeping her voice just low enough to avoid a public scene. "I specifically instructed you to use the staff entrance. You are supposed to be in the back room." Before I could formulate a response, Caroline appeared beside our mother. She held a crystal flute of sparkling cider, eyeing my gown with a mixture of intense jealousy and deep disdain. She raised her voice deliberately, projecting it so the surrounding clusters of wealthy guests would hear every single word. "You have some nerve showing up in a fake designer dress," Caroline mocked, gesturing dismissively at my gown. "Who are you trying to fool, Madeline? Did you Uber here? I hope you did not ask the valets to park whatever broken-down rented sedan you are driving these days. We have actual important guests to accommodate tonight." A few nearby couples turned to look, their expressions shifting into masks of polite curiosity. Patricia smiled tightly, clearly pleased that Caroline was putting me in my place. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely serene. I did not take the bait. I simply looked at my sister as if she were a small, misbehaving child. "The dress is a custom piece straight from Milan, Caroline," I replied smoothly, my voice carrying effortlessly over the string quartet playing in the background. "And no, I did not use an Uber. My private driver is waiting down the street. I would hate to clutter Richard's driveway." Patricia scoffed loudly. "Stop lying. We all know your little freelance hobby is completely bankrupt. Now go to the overflow table before I have security remove you." Just as Patricia raised her hand to summon a guard, the grand entrance doors swung open behind me. A sudden palpable hush fell over the foyer. Jonathan Hayes, the billionaire CEO of Nexus Tech and one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley, stepped into the room. He was the ultimate white whale for Desmond's fraudulent crypto pitch. If Jonathan invested, everyone else in the room would blindly follow. Richard materialized out of nowhere, practically shoving another guest aside to reach the entrance. He smoothed his tie and thrust his hand forward with a desperate, ingratiating smile. "Jonathan," my father boomed. "What an absolute honor. Welcome to our home. Let me take your coat and introduce you to my son-in-law, Desmond. We have a phenomenal financial opportunity to share with you tonight." Jonathan Hayes did not even look at my father. He walked straight past Richard's outstretched hand, completely ignoring him. His eyes locked onto me, and his face broke into a massive, genuine smile. He strode directly into the center of the hostile circle my family had formed around me. "Madeline," Jonathan exclaimed, pulling me into a warm embrace and kissing my cheek. "It is wonderful to see you outside of the boardroom. Thank you for saving our PR crisis last week. You are an absolute genius. My entire executive board was ready to panic until your team scrubbed that digital leak in under an hour. We owe your agency everything." The silence in the foyer was deafening. My father's outstretched hand fell limply to his side. His jaw actually dropped. Patricia stared at Jonathan Hayes as if the billionaire had just spoken in a foreign language. Caroline's smug smirk completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. They had spent the entire week believing Richard had successfully blacklisted my tiny, struggling startup. They had absolutely no idea that I was the personal crisis manager for the very titans of industry they were desperately trying to impress. "You are too kind, Jonathan," I replied warmly, projecting my voice so every single investor in the room could hear. It was my pleasure to handle the situation. We value our partnership with Nexus Tech. Jonathan laughed, patting my shoulder. I was dreading this stuffy dinner, but knowing you are here makes it infinitely better. We need to schedule a meeting next week to renegotiate your retainer. I want you on exclusive contract. Desmond watched the entire exchange from the edge of the hallway. The color rapidly drained from his face. He realized instantly that the social hierarchy of the room had just violently inverted. The wealthy investors were no longer looking at Richard or Caroline. They were looking at me with deep, newfound respect. Desmond was losing his captive audience, and the walls of his financial scam were closing in. He clapped his hands together loudly, his palms slick with nervous sweat. He plastered on a frantic artificial smile. If everyone could please make their way into the grand dining hall, Desmond announced, his voice cracking slightly. We have a spectacular Thanksgiving feast prepared by Le Petit Chien, and I have an exclusive ground floor investment presentation to share with you all before the first course. Jonathan offered me his arm. Shall we? He asked politely. I smiled, slipping my hand through his arm and locking eyes with my terrified brother-in-law. Lead the way, Desmond. I said, my voice dripping with lethal anticipation. I wouldn't miss this pitch for the world. The grand dining hall of my parents' estate was an absurd display of artificial opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table, which was weighed down by Chef Anton's magnificent creations. I took my seat right next to Jonathan Hayes, deliberately ignoring the furious glares shooting from my parents at the head of the table. Desmond stood at the front of the room, flanked by two large projection screens displaying the sleek, completely fraudulent logo for Apex Coin. Richard tapped his silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The gentle chiming brought the room of 50 wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites to a quiet halt. He stood up, puffing out his chest and wearing a smile so calculated it looked painful. We have much to be thankful for this year, Richard boomed, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a seasoned salesman. Our family continues to grow and prosper. I want to raise a glass to my beautiful daughter Caroline, who is bringing a new life into our legacy. Caroline smiled demurely, resting a hand on her pregnant belly, as polite applause rippled through the room. But tonight is not just about family. Richard continued, gesturing grandly toward Desmond. It is about the future. I am incredibly proud to officially announce Desmond as the new Vice President of Wilson Manufacturing. And to celebrate this promotion, he is offering everyone in this room an exclusive ground floor opportunity to invest in the future of decentralized finance. Apex Coin is going to revolutionize the market. Richard then turned his gaze directly toward me. His warm smile vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, warning glare. He pointed his champagne flute right at me across the length of the long table. And let this be a lesson, Richard announced, his tone dropping to a harsh reprimand. Those who turn their backs on family values will always eat the scraps. We reward loyalty in this family. We do not reward betrayal. The room grew uncomfortably silent. A few guests shifted in their padded chairs, exchanging nervous glances. Patricia gave a tight, highly satisfied nod from her seat. They fully expected me to shrink down to absorb the public humiliation, just like I had when I was a teenager, desperate for their approval. Instead, I picked up my silver fork and struck the rim of my crystal water glass. The sharp, clear ring sliced right through the heavy tension. I pushed my chair back and stood up, smoothing the front of my emerald green gown. I looked directly into my father's eyes. A beautiful toast, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly steady and carrying to the very back of the hall. But before everyone writes a check for Desmond's new crypto token, they should probably know where the last $15 million went. A collective gasp echoed across the dining room. Jonathan Hayes leaned forward in his chair, suddenly intensely interested. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. Patricia dropped her fork onto her porcelain plate with a loud, ringing clatter. Sit down, Madeline, Richard growled, abandoning all pretense of holiday cheer. You are making a scene. I am perfectly calm, I replied, taking a step toward the front of the room where Desmond was standing frozen by his presentation screens. Desmond claims Apex Coin is a secure investment, but what he has failed to mention to your esteemed guests is that he has been using a backdoor access point into Wilson Manufacturing's operational accounts. He drained $15 million to cover his massive losses from his last 3 failed ventures. Desmond's eyes darted wildly around the room. He realized his entire facade was disintegrating in real time in front of Connecticut's most powerful investors. He panicked. He lunged forward from the projector screen, grabbing a full oversized glass of red wine from the nearest table. With a sharp, aggressive sweep of his arm, he intentionally hurled the dark red liquid directly at me. The wine splashed heavily across the front of my silk emerald gown, staining the expensive fabric instantly. Several guests cried out in shock. Jonathan Hayes half stood from his chair, anger flashing in his eyes. "Oops." Desmond sneered, his chest heaving as he tried to mask his blind panic with arrogant cruelty. He pointed toward the hallway. "Guess you better go to the bathroom and clean up right now." He truly thought the public embarrassment of a ruined dress would make me run away crying. He thought I was still the little girl who dreaded making a scene. I did not flinch. I did not even look down at the dark stain ruining the silk. I kept my eyes locked on his terrified, sweating face. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown, pulled out a thick stack of printed financial documents, and slammed them down onto the mahogany dining table. The sharp slap of the heavy paper against the mahogany echoed like a gunshot. The gasps from the guests died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. The dark red wine dripped from the hem of my silk gown onto the polished floor, but I kept my posture rigid and my gaze fixed entirely on my father. Patricia broke the silence. Her face contorted into a mask of absolute fury. She pointed a trembling diamond-ringed finger at me and shrieked at the top of her lungs. "Guards! Remove her immediately. She is trespassing and unhinged. Throw her out." 2 large security guards in sharp black suits stood flanking the grand double doors of the dining hall. At Patricia's command, they did absolutely nothing. They remained perfectly still, their hands clasped in front of them, staring straight ahead. "Did you not hear me?" Patricia screeched, her voice cracking with hysteria. She marched toward the nearest guard, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood. "Grab her and throw her out onto the street. You work for us." The guard slowly turned his head to look at my mother. His expression was completely blank. "No, ma'am, we do not." I smiled, a cold and razor-sharp expression. I stepped away from the table, ensuring the entire room was watching me. "They work for Le Petit Chien, mother, and as of 48 hours ago, I became the sole owner of the entire catering conglomerate through a blind proxy. I sign the paychecks for every waiter, every bartender, and every security guard standing in this room. They take their orders from me." Patricia froze in her tracks. She looked wildly from the guards to the waitstaff, who had all quietly stopped serving and stepped back against the walls, effectively sealing the room. We had them trapped. I turned my back on my sputtering mother and faced the crowd. I locked eyes with Jonathan Hayes, who was watching the scene unfold with an expression of intense, calculated fascination. 15 years ago, I began my voice ringing out clearly across the silent hall. My parents stole my grandfather's patents to build the very foundation of this house. They forced Theodore into a corner, stripped him of his life's work, and built an empire on stolen ground. I gestured toward Desmond and Richard. "Today, they are trying to steal your money to keep it." Richard finally found his voice. He slammed his fist onto the table. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She is a disgruntled former employee trying to ruin a legitimate business presentation with slander." "Is it slander, Dad?" I asked calmly. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my secure mobile device. With 2 swift taps on the screen, I accessed the central audiovisual network Desmond had set up for his grand presentation. The massive projection screens flanking Desmond flickered. The sleek, fraudulent Apex Coin logo vanished. In its place, high-definition scans of heavily redacted legal deeds, bank transfer confirmations, and Delaware LLC ownership documents illuminated the room in stark, glaring white light. The guests in the room were not fools. They were seasoned bankers, hedge fund managers, and venture capitalists. It took them less than 10 seconds to read the fine print projected on the walls. A low collective murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. I watched as 3 different investors immediately reached for their phones to contact their brokers. What you are looking at is the complete corporate debt portfolio of Wilson Manufacturing, I announced, projecting my voice over the rising whispers. High-risk distressed corporate bonds that were quietly purchased and consolidated by my proxy firm just before the market opened yesterday. Richard turned slowly to look at the screens. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. His eyes tracked the highlighted numbers, the total liabilities, and the irrefutable signature of the new primary creditor. I walked slowly toward him. The wine-stained silk of my dress felt like a battle standard, a physical manifestation of their desperate failing attacks. I stopped right at the head of the table, looking my father dead in the eye. "I own 80% of your company's liabilities, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register that forced the entire room to lean in to listen. Richard gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white. He opened his mouth desperately, searching for a lie, an excuse, or a threat. He found nothing. I did not give him the chance to breathe. I delivered the final crushing blow. "And because you panicked," I stated, leaning slightly closer. "Because you transferred your last $15 million in protected cash reserves to Desmond's offshore accounts yesterday morning. To fund this pathetic scam, you violated the core operational covenants of your loan." Desmond backed away from the projection screen, looking like he was going to be physically ill. Caroline sat frozen in her chair, her hands clutching her pregnant belly, entirely speechless. I held Richard's terrified gaze. "You officially defaulted on your loan at exactly 5 o'clock today. There is no grace period. There is no bailout. I hold the execution switch." I smiled, cold and victorious. "I own everything." For a fraction of a second, the heavy mahogany dining table was a frozen tableau. Then the room shattered into absolute bedlam. The silence was ripped apart by the scraping of heavy wooden chairs and the explosive shouts of 50 panicked investors. A silver-haired venture capitalist at the far end of the table threw his linen napkin onto his plate, dialing his phone with trembling fingers. The regional banking executives were practically shouting over one another, aggressively demanding answers. The perfectly orchestrated Thanksgiving gala had instantly devolved into a financial bloodbath. Richard desperately tried to grab control of the collapsing room. He let out a loud, entirely hollow laugh that echoed terribly against the crystal chandeliers. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, trying to physically push the panic back down. His face was a dangerous mottled red, and the veins in his neck strained against his starched white collar. "Please, everyone settle down," Richard bellowed, flashing a sickeningly wide artificial smile. "This is nothing more than a sick, elaborate joke. My daughter has always had a flair for the dramatic. She is a disgruntled former employee holding a childish grudge because she was not cut out for the corporate world. These documents are completely fabricated. Wilson Manufacturing is entirely solvent. I assure you, your investments are perfectly safe." Jonathan Hayes did not sit down. The Silicon Valley billionaire picked up the top packet of documents I had slammed onto the table, flipping through the pages with a practiced analytical eye. His jaw tightened as he read the Delaware LLC registration, the verified banking seals, and the unredacted transfer protocols. He did not look like a man who believed it was a joke. Before Richard could attempt another desperate lie to soothe the bleeding crowd, the heavy oak doors at the back of the dining hall swung wide open. Mitchell stepped into the room. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit and carried his battered leather briefcase, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable authority. He walked past the frozen security guards, his hard leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. He did not look at my parents. He walked straight to the head of the table and stopped directly beside me. He unlatched his briefcase with a sharp metallic snap that commanded the immediate attention of every executive in the room. "These documents are fully authenticated and filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying the immense weight of federal law. "My name is Mitchell Vance, managing partner of Vance and Sterling. I represent the blind proxy firm that acquired the entirety of Wilson Manufacturing's distressed corporate bonds." Mitchell pulled a secondary stack of certified bank records from his briefcase and laid them neatly next to mine. He looked directly at Jonathan Hayes, addressing the most powerful man in the room. I can officially confirm that Richard Wilson transferred $15 million of protected operational capital into an unauthorized offshore account at 9 o'clock yesterday morning, Mitchell stated clinically. He then turned his gaze to my father. As of 5 o'clock today, Wilson Manufacturing is entirely insolvent and in catastrophic breach of all loan covenants. The company is officially bankrupt. The murmurs of the crowd escalated into a deafening roar. Jonathan Hayes threw the documents back onto the table in disgust, shooting Richard a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. The wealthy socialites who had been sipping champagne just moments ago were now scrambling toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a massive corporate fraud. Desmond was hyperventilating near the projection screens. He tugged violently at the collar of his custom tuxedo as if it were physically choking him. His grand crypto pitch was dead. His offshore scam was exposed to a room full of federal witnesses. He was looking at decades in prison, and the realization was causing him to literally gasp for air. That was when Caroline completely lost her mind. The illusion of her perfect wealthy life was disintegrating in front of her country club peers. Her guaranteed inheritance was vaporizing into thin air. She pushed her chair back so violently it crashed backward onto the hardwood floor. She stomped toward the front of the room, her face twisted into a mask of ugly, feral entitlement. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical scream. "You jealous witch!" Caroline shrieked, tears of pure rage ruining her expensive makeup. "You planned this just to ruin my life. You have always hated me. You are just mad because Grandpa loved me more. He knew you were cold and bitter, and that is why he left me the will. He wanted me to have the estate, and you simply cannot stand it." Patricia rushed forward, trying to grab Caroline's arm to pull her back, but Caroline shoved her mother away, completely unhinged by the loss of her fortune. "He loved me," Caroline sobbed aggressively at the remaining guests, desperately trying to salvage some shred of her victimhood. "He gave me everything, because I was the only one who actually cared about him. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysteria. I simply let her desperate, greedy words hang in the heavy air for every single guest to hear. She was using a dead man's love as a shield for her own crimes, wrapping herself in the memory of the grandfather she had ruthlessly tortured. I reached into the hidden pocket of my emerald gown and pulled out a small, sleek black remote control. I held it up, letting the polished plastic catch the light of the chandeliers. "Did he love you more, Caroline?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet, but carrying effortlessly across the hushed room. "Or did you simply force him to sign it?" I did not wait for her to formulate another lie. I pressed the button on the remote. The massive projection screens behind Desmond flickered instantly. The bright white financial documents vanished. In their place, the grainy black and white security footage from the Oak Creek Care Facility filled the massive walls. The timestamp blinked brightly in the bottom corner. The entire room went dead silent as the video began to play. The massive projection screens flickered from stark white financial tables to a dull, grainy gray. The timestamp in the corner pulsed silently. The camera angle looked down onto a sterile hospital bed. The figure lying there was barely recognizable, but the entire room knew it was Theodore Wilson. He was hooked up to a ventilator, his chest rising in shallow, agonizingly slow intervals. The high society crowd leaned in, their breathing syncing with the dying man on the screen. Then the heavy door on the video swung open. Desmond and Caroline marched into the frame. There was no audio, but the violent intent in their body language screamed through the silence. Desmond grabbed my grandfather's frail, bruised wrist. He ripped the oxygen monitor from Theodore's finger and shoved a heavy fountain pen into his hand. I watched the faces of the investors illuminated by the pale light of the projector. Complete paralyzing horror washed over them. A prominent judge sitting near the front row covered her mouth with both hands. Jonathan Hayes stood completely rigid, his eyes locked on the screen in pure disgust. On the video, Theodore weakly tried to pull his hand away. He was crying. Desmond ignored the tears. He locked his grip around my grandfather's knuckles and forcibly dragged the pen across the legal document resting on the tray table. Caroline stood directly beside the bed. She did not look away. She did not try to stop it. She simply watched her arms crossed, waiting for the forgery to be complete. The collective gasp that erupted from the 50 wealthy guests was deafening. It was a visceral sound of revulsion. The silence of the gala shattered into a chaotic chorus of disgusted whispers and outraged shouts. Caroline's legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her expensive maternity gown pooling around her. She buried her face in her hands and began sobbing hysterically. Her previous screams about being the beloved favorite echoed in the minds of everyone present, making the reality on the screen even more grotesque. She was a fraud, a criminal, and an abuser, and her entire social circle had just watched her commit the crime in high definition. Desmond staggered backward, his eyes wide and unblinking. The slick, arrogant cryptocurrency entrepreneur was gone. In his place was a terrified criminal realizing he was completely trapped. He spun around his expensive Italian leather shoes, slipping frantically against the mahogany floor, and bolted toward the grand double doors leading to the foyer. He did not even make it halfway. Two massive, broad-shouldered investors stepped directly into the aisle, forming an impenetrable human wall. One was a former Marine turned venture capitalist. He planted his feet, crossed his thick arms, and glared down at Desmond with a look of pure menace. "You are not going anywhere, son," the investor growled, shoving Desmond hard in the chest. "You sit down and wait for the authorities." Desmond stumbled backward, crashing into a serving cart. Crystal glasses shattered across the floor, raining sharp shards over the oriental rug. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. Richard stood at the head of the table, his chest heaving. The illusion of his empire was entirely obliterated. He had lost his company, his reputation, and his freedom in a matter of minutes. His survival instinct, honed by decades of ruthless corporate backstabbing, violently kicked in. He needed a scapegoat. He needed anyone else to take the fall. Richard rounded the corner of the table and marched toward Desmond, his face purple with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at his son-in-law. "You idiot!" Richard roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You swore to me it was clean. You told me nobody was in the hallway and the cameras were off. You forged that document and you dragged my daughter into your sick scheme. You have ruined us." The guests recoiled in disgust. Richard was actively throwing his own family under the bus to save his own skin, completely oblivious to the fact that everyone in the room could see right through his pathetic act of self-preservation. Desmond backed against the wall, his eyes darting wildly around the room. He looked at the angry investors, the shattered glass, and finally at my father. A dark, vicious realization settled over his panicked face. If he was going down, he was going to drag the king down with him. Desmond straightened up, his chest heaving, and pointed a shaking finger right back at Richard. "Do not play innocent with me!" Desmond screamed, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "You ordered me to do it. You practically dragged me into that hospital room. You needed that $50 million immediately, and you did not care how we got it. You needed it to cover up your massive federal tax evasion before the IRS audited the manufacturing accounts. You are the one going to prison, Richard." Desmond's accusation hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the remaining facade of aristocratic civility completely disintegrated. Richard let out a guttural, animalistic roar. He lunged across the shattered crystal and broken china, his hands curled into fists. He slammed into Desmond with the force of a desperate man fighting for his very life. The impact sent both men crashing backward into the heavy catering station. Silver trays, chafing dishes, and towers of champagne flutes cascaded to the hardwood floor in a deafening avalanche of metal and glass. "You ungrateful parasite!" Richard bellowed, wrapping his hands around Desmond's silk collar and slamming him against the custom wood paneling. "I gave you everything. I brought you into this family, and you dare accuse me of your incompetence?" Desmond clawed frantically at Richard's face, his expensive manicure scraping across my father's cheek and drawing bright lines of blood. "I did what I was told," Desmond screamed, driving his knee upward into Richard's stomach. "You said Theodore was practically gone anyway. You said nobody would ever look at the video logs if the will was notarized by your private attorneys. The two men wrestled to the floor, rolling through spilled wine and ruined appetizers. It was a pathetic, ugly brawl. The polished CEO and the sleek tech visionary were reduced to violently clawing at each other in the dirt, entirely oblivious to the horrified gasps of the venture capitalists and politicians watching their public meltdown. Jonathan Hayes pulled his chair back, physically distancing himself from the pathetic display, his face a mask of absolute revulsion. Amidst the chaos of the physical altercation, Patricia scrambled across the room toward her golden child. Caroline was still on her knees, hyperventilating, her hands desperately clutching her pregnant stomach as she watched her husband and her father beat each other bloody. Patricia grabbed Caroline by the shoulders and shook her violently. "Stop crying and listen to me right now," Patricia hissed, her voice cutting through the noise with venomous urgency. "You tell them he acted alone. You tell these people that Desmond manipulated you. Tell them you were terrified for your baby. Play the pregnancy card, Caroline, or you are going to give birth in a federal penitentiary." Caroline stared at her mother, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal finally snapped her fragile, pampered mind. She slapped Patricia's hands away with a sharp, vicious crack. "Do not touch me." Caroline shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the sounds of the brawl. "You are not putting this on me. You forced us to do it. You were the one who found out Grandpa changed his will to leave the estate to the foundation. You came to us crying that the IRS was going to seize the house and seize the trust funds. Keep your mouth shut, you stupid girl," Patricia growled, lunging forward to cover Caroline's mouth. But Caroline shoved her backwards, scrambling to her feet and backing away like a cornered prey animal. "I will not go to jail for you," Caroline screamed, pointing frantically at her mother. "You stood right there in the hallway while we were in his room. You stood lookout. You told me that if we did not get that money, we would lose the country club, we would lose the cars, and we would end up poor and pathetic like Madeline. You said you would rather die than live like her. You orchestrated the entire thing." The room was paralyzed by the rapid-fire confessions. Every desperate attempt they made to save themselves only incriminated them further. They were violently ripping each other apart, shedding every ounce of family loyalty to avoid the sinking ship. The elegant Wilson family was dead, replaced by a pack of rabid animals turning on their own. I stood perfectly still at the head of the dining table. I smoothed the skirt of my wine-stained emerald gown and simply watched the empire of lies burn to ash. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue. I just needed to let them destroy themselves. I reached out and picked up the sleek silver microphone resting on the podium Desmond had used for his fraudulent cryptocurrency pitch. I tapped the top of the microphone twice. The sharp, amplified thud cut right through the screaming and the sounds of the scuffle on the floor. The fighting slowed. Richard and Desmond froze, panting heavily, tangled in each other's ruined suits. Patricia stopped advancing on Caroline. They all turned their heads to look at me, their faces pale, bruised, and dripping with sweat. "Thank you all for the confessions," I said, my voice echoing evenly and coldly through the high-end surround sound speakers of the dining hall. "It certainly saves the investigators a tremendous amount of paperwork." Patricia swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the microphone in my hand. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a new profound dread. I smiled, a slow, predatory expression. "This microphone is connected directly to the venue's central recording system, Mother. Every single word spoken in this room tonight, from Desmond's admission of wire fraud to Richard's tax evasion to your coordinated conspiracy to commit elder abuse and forgery, has been captured in crystal clear, high-definition audio. And because I own the catering conglomerate that operates this venue, those digital files were just automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server." I paused, letting the absolute finality of my words sink into their terrified minds. I looked at my father, who was still kneeling in the spilled wine, his hands shaking violently. "And that server," I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper, "is directly shared with the Fraud Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the District Attorney's Office." Right on cue, a harsh, pulsating light swept across the grand dining hall. Red and blue strobes began flashing intensely through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the walls of the estate in the undeniable colors of law enforcement. The wail of multiple approaching sirens pierced the quiet Connecticut night, growing louder and more deafening by the second. Heavy tires screeched to a halt on the gravel driveway outside. Car doors slammed in rapid succession. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Her knees buckled beneath her. She dropped heavily to the hardwood floor, her designer gown pooling around her as she stared at the flashing red and blue lights in pure, unadulterated terror. The harsh glare of the police lights washed over the dining room walls, painting the terrified faces of my family in alternating shades of crimson and stark blue. The wail of the sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the heavy synchronized slamming of reinforced car doors outside. Through the massive front windows, dozens of federal agents in tactical gear swarmed the manicured lawns of the estate. Richard scrambled to his feet, slipping on the spilled wine. His bravado was entirely gone. He was no longer a commanding CEO. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. He lunged toward me, his hands raised in a desperate, trembling gesture of surrender. "Madeline, wait," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking as he closed the distance between us. "You can stop this. You have the power to stop this right now. Call them off. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them it is just a family dispute over corporate restructuring." I watched him sweat. I did not move an inch. "I will give you everything," Richard stammered frantically, waving his arms around the opulent dining hall. "I will sign the estate over to you tonight. I will transfer all my voting shares in the manufacturing company to your holding firm. You can be the CEO. You can have the house, the cars, the entire legacy. Just pick up your phone and call the district attorney. Please, Madeline, you are my daughter." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel like a worthless burden. "You have absolutely nothing to offer me, Richard," I replied, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You cannot give me a company that is already legally insolvent. I already own your debt. And as for this house, it was built with blood money stolen from a man who actually loved me. You are trying to barter with ashes." A sharp, desperate sob broke from the floor. Patricia crawled across the hardwood, her expensive gown soaking up the puddles of red wine and shattered crystal. She lunged forward, her manicured hands gripping the fabric of my dress with bruising force. "We are your parents," Patricia wailed, her face contorted in absolute raw panic. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot send us to a federal prison. We gave you a roof over your head. We raised you. We are your blood." I looked down at the woman who had orchestrated my financial ruin, the woman who had stood lookout while her favorite daughter forged a dying man's signature just to ensure I received nothing. I reached down and coldly, methodically peeled her trembling fingers off my dress. I stepped back, severing the physical contact completely. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a single crumpled piece of paper. It was the exact same $100 bill Patricia had thrown at my feet months ago, the pathetic scrap she had offered me when she told me to leave her sight forever. I let the crumpled bill drop. It fluttered down, landing perfectly on the wine-soaked floor, right in front of her knees. "Take an Uber, Mom," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "It is time for you to be independent." Patricia stared at the wet bill, as if it were a venomous snake. She let out a guttural sound of pure despair, curling into herself on the floor. To my left, Caroline dragged herself across the room. Her earlier rage had completely evaporated, replaced by blinding, suffocating terror. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table to pull herself up, her breathing shallow and frantic. She wrapped both hands protectively around her pregnant belly. "Madeline, please." Caroline begged, her voice high and breathless. "I am pregnant. I am bringing a child into this world. You cannot send a pregnant woman to jail. The stress will hurt the baby. Desmond forced me to do it. Mom forced me to do it. Please have mercy on my baby." She was using her unborn child as a human shield, desperately hoping my basic human decency would override the evidence of her undeniable crimes. She was still relying on the same manipulative tactics that had allowed her to coast through life without a single consequence. I looked at my sister. Her tear-streaked face was a portrait of pathetic entitlement. "You are 31 years old, Caroline," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "Time to grow up." A booming, thunderous crash shook the very foundation of the house. The grand oak doors of the foyer did not just open. They were violently kicked inward, the heavy wood slamming against the plaster walls with explosive force. Dozens of federal agents flooded into the grand entryway, their tactical flashlights cutting through the dim lighting of the estate. The dining hall erupted into a flurry of organized chaos. Over a dozen federal agents in dark tactical gear poured through the shattered oak doors, their heavy boots trampling over the spilled wine and crushed crystal. The stark, blinding beams of their tactical flashlights swept across the terrified faces of Connecticut's elite, cutting through the warm golden glow of the chandeliers. The sheer physical presence of the FBI raid instantly suffocated the last remaining breaths of the Wilson family dynasty. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver badge clipped to his belt, marched directly to the head of the long mahogany table. He did not look at the fleeing socialites or the panicked venture capitalists. His gaze was locked firmly on my father and brother-in-law. Richard Wilson and Desmond Vance, the lead agent, barked, his voice vibrating with absolute, unquestionable authority. "You are both under arrest." Richard stood frozen. The last remnants of his arrogant, untouchable facade melted away, leaving a pathetic, trembling old man in a ruined custom suit. He opened his mouth, trying to summon the commanding tone he had used to terrorize his employees and family for decades, but only a dry, rattling wheeze came out. "On what charges?" Richard finally choked out, his eyes darting frantically toward the flashing red and blue lights outside the windows. "Corporate fraud, massive federal tax evasion, and conspiracy." The agent replied sharply, signaling two heavily armed officers to move forward. They grabbed Richard's arms, roughly pulling them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel cuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over the terrified murmurs of the crowd. Desmond did not handle the reality of his situation with even a fraction of Richard's ruined dignity. As two agents grabbed his torn silk tuxedo jacket, Desmond's knees buckled entirely. He collapsed against the edge of the mahogany table, openly weeping. He wailed like a terrified child, tears and snot streaming down his bruised, scratched face. "I was just following orders!" Desmond sobbed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate shriek. "Richard made me do it. I am a victim of manipulation. Please, do not put me in handcuffs. I am an innovator. You cannot do this to me." The agents completely ignored his pathetic, flailing cries. They yanked him upward without an ounce of sympathy, pinning his arms and locking the steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. Desmond continued to bawl, his chest heaving, as the reality of a federal prison sentence crushed the breath out of his lungs. The 50 wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites who had come to celebrate the Wilson family wealth were now actively participating in its destruction. Dozens of smartphone screens lit up the dim dining room. The elite crowd, the very people my parents had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress, were relentlessly recording every single second of the humiliating spectacle. Richard and Desmond were being paraded as common criminals on high-definition video that would be circulating through every country club, boardroom, and news outlet in the state before midnight. Patricia watched her husband and golden son-in-law get detained with wide, horrified eyes. She slowly pushed herself up from the wine-soaked floor, brushing her hands down her ruined, stained gown. She immediately shifted tactics. Her face contorted into a mask of delicate, fragile innocence. She clasped her hands over her heart, looking up at the lead agent with wide, pleading eyes. "Officers, please," Patricia cooed, pitching her voice to sound like a helpless, terrified victim. "There has been a terrible mistake. I am just a housewife. I spend my days planning charity galas and tending to my garden. I know absolutely nothing about their business dealings, their taxes, or their offshore accounts. I am completely innocent in all of this." Mitchell stepped smoothly out of the shadows, his battered leather briefcase already open. He walked straight up to the lead federal agent and handed him a thick bound folder filled with stark white documents. "Agent Miller," Mitchell said clearly, ensuring his voice carried to the recording phones of the guests. "Inside, you will find the recovered hard drives from Wilson Manufacturing's original internal servers. Specifically, you will find a verified email thread dated exactly 15 years ago. Patricia's breath hitched violently. She took a panicked step backward, her mask of innocence shattering into a million pieces. Those emails provide irrefutable digital proof that Patricia Wilson personally orchestrated the theft of Theodore Wilson's initial patents, Mitchell announced to the room, his tone clinical and lethal. She hired the corporate spies, she authorized the digital breach, and she ordered the destruction of the original ownership ledgers. She is not a housewife. She is the architect of the entire fraud. The lead agent flipped open the folder, scanning the top page, highlighting the damning correspondence. He looked up, his eyes locking onto my mother with a hardened glare. Patricia Wilson, you are also under arrest for conspiracy and corporate espionage, he stated. Patricia opened her mouth to scream, but a female agent was already spinning her around, snapping the handcuffs onto her diamond-covered wrists. She thrashed wildly, her expensive heels slipping on the wet floor, screeching threats and curses that completely exposed her true vicious nature, but the agents held her in an iron grip. Caroline remained on the floor. She was completely untouched by the federal agents. No one read her rights. No one approached her with handcuffs. She was legally innocent of the corporate crimes, but she had lost absolutely everything else. She sat in the puddle of spilled wine and broken glass, hugging her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. The golden child was entirely stripped of her status, her stolen wealth, and her arrogant pride. She watched through dull, vacant eyes as her crying husband and screaming parents were dragged toward the door. She was going to be a single mother with zero financial assets, publicly disgraced, and universally despised by the high society she worshipped. She was finally truly alone. The agents began marching my family toward the shattered grand oak doors. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated their path of absolute ruin. As Richard was forced past me, he dug his heels into the hardwood floor, forcing the agents to pause for a fraction of a second. He turned his head and glared at me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, burning with a toxic mixture of pure hatred and utter defeat. "You are nothing but a traitor!" Richard spat, his voice trembling with bitter venom. I looked at his ruined, handcuffed form. I stood tall in my emerald gown, the true owner of the very ground he was standing on. I did not flinch. I let a slow, victorious smirk spread across my face. "No, Dad." I replied, my voice perfectly steady and echoing clearly over the wailing sirens outside. "I am the CEO." 48 hours later, the sprawling Connecticut estate was entirely unrecognizable. The warm golden glow of the crystal chandeliers had been abruptly cut off, leaving the grand hallways feeling cavernous, cold, and hollow. The opulent Thanksgiving decorations had been stripped away, replaced by stark neon federal foreclosure notices taped across the grand double doors. The Wilson dynasty had completely evaporated, leaving nothing behind but the staggering weight of their exposed crimes. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, holding a steaming cup of dark coffee, watching the final dismantling of an empire built on lies. My private security team lined the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder with absolute stoicism. They were there to ensure the court-ordered eviction proceeded exactly to my specifications. Patricia slowly descended the sweeping mahogany staircase. She had managed to post bail late last night, but the ordeal had completely shattered her immaculate facade. She looked 20 years older. Her signature blonde hair was flat and stringy, her skin was pale and deeply lined, and the expensive silk blouse she wore looked wrinkled and absurdly out of place. Caroline trailed closely behind her mother, leaning heavily against the banister. She was no longer screaming or throwing tantrums. She was completely drained, her face puffy and red from 2 straight days of uninterrupted weeping. Desmond was sitting in a federal holding cell, entirely unable to post the massive bail the judge had set for wire fraud and elder abuse. Caroline was effectively a single penniless mother. They reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped abruptly. At the center of the marble floor, directly between them and the front door, sat a large cardboard box filled with heavy-duty industrial black plastic trash bags. Patricia stared at the cheap plastic rolls with pure visceral revulsion. She looked up at me, her eyes darting nervously to the large security guards flanking my sides. Where are our suitcases? Patricia demanded, her voice a weak, trembling imitation of her former arrogance. The Louis Vuitton luggage sets are in the master closet. Tell your hired thugs to go upstairs and retrieve them immediately. We are taking our personal belongings. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I let the silence stretch out, forcing them to stand awkwardly in the cold foyer. The Louis Vuitton luggage was purchased using corporate funds from Wilson Manufacturing. I stated, my voice echoing clearly against the high ceilings. Therefore, the luggage is currently property of the federal government pending asset forfeiture. You do not get to keep the spoils of your financial crimes. Caroline let out a loud, pathetic whimper, clutching her pregnant stomach. I cannot carry plastic bags, she whined, her voice nasal and grating. I am pregnant. My back hurts. This is inhumane, Madeline. You cannot treat us like animals. I lowered my coffee cup, my expression turning to absolute ice. I walked slowly toward the box, pulled out two thick black trash bags, and threw them onto the marble floor at their feet. 10 years ago, I said, staring directly into Patricia's terrified eyes. You stood on this exact same marble floor. You told me I was a disappointment, a failure, and a complete waste of space. You refused to let me use a single bag from this house. You handed me a roll of black garbage bags and told me that because I was trash, my belongings belonged in the trash. I am simply honoring your established family traditions. Patricia flinched violently as if I had physically struck her. She looked down at the black plastic, her lower lip trembling. She realized I was not going to yield. I was not going to show mercy. Pack your things, I ordered, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather whatever clothing fits into those bags. Anything left behind becomes property of the holding company. Move. The next 15 minutes were a masterclass in poetic justice. I watched in total silence as two women who had spent their entire lives treating service workers like dirt were forced to physically stuff their wrinkled clothing into cheap plastic bags. The loud, abrasive crinkling of the trash bags echoed through the empty mansion. Patricia snagged her manicured nail on a zipper, tearing the side of her bag and letting out a sharp cry of frustration. Caroline struggled to shove bulky maternity sweaters into the plastic, sobbing loudly with every movement. Time is up, the lead security guard announced, stepping forward. Patricia and Caroline dragged their heavy, bulging trash bags across the marble floor. They walked toward the front doors, their heads bowed in total defeat. But as Caroline passed the center of the foyer, I noticed her posture was unnaturally stiff. Her left hand was buried deep inside the oversized pocket of her heavy wool cardigan, and she was moving with a frantic, nervous energy, trying to rush past the guards. Stop her, I commanded. The lead security guard immediately stepped directly into Caroline's path, blocking the exit. Caroline gasped, taking a panicked step backward. Do not touch me, Caroline shrieked instantly, defaulting to her victim routine. I am a pregnant woman. You are assaulting me. The guard did not move a single muscle. He held out a small plastic security bin. Empty your pockets, ma'am. Right now. Patricia rushed forward, her maternal instincts momentarily overriding her terror. You cannot search her without a warrant, Patricia screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the guard. We will sue you for everything you have. We will drag you into court. I laughed, a harsh, dry sound that stopped my mother dead in her tracks. You have exactly $0 in your bank accounts, Mother. You cannot even afford to buy a cup of coffee, let alone retain legal counsel. Empty the pockets, Caroline, or my team will detain you for corporate theft until the federal agents return. Caroline squeezed her eyes shut. Fresh tears spilled over her eyelashes. Her chest heaved with panicked, ragged breaths. Slowly, she pulled her trembling hand out of her cardigan pocket. Her fingers opened over the plastic bin. A heavy, solid gold object dropped into the container with a loud, metallic clatter. I walked over and looked down into the bin. Resting against the plastic was Theodore's vintage gold Rolex. It was the exact watch he had worn every single day of his life, the watch Caroline had stripped from his nightstand, while Desmond was physically forcing a pen into my dying grandfather's hand. I reached in and picked up the heavy gold timepiece. The metal felt cold against my palm. I looked at my sister, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, sterile disgust. You stole this from a comatose man, I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the full weight of a judge handing down a sentence. You do not get to walk out of here wearing his legacy. I nodded to the guards. They stepped aside, opening the massive double doors. A bitter, biting November wind swept into the foyer. Patricia and Caroline grabbed their black trash bags and stumbled out onto the grand stone porch. The guards immediately pulled the heavy doors shut behind them, leaving only a narrow gap for me to stand in the threshold. The Connecticut estate loomed behind me, utterly silent and completely mine. Patricia turned around on the stone steps. The biting wind whipped her flat blonde hair across her face. She dropped her trash bag and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. "Where are we supposed to go?" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking as she gestured wildly to the empty, sprawling driveway. "Our accounts are entirely frozen. Our credit cards are declining. Desmond's assets are seized. We have absolutely nowhere to sleep tonight. You cannot just leave your own family on the street." I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers wrapped around a small, jagged piece of metal attached to a cheap, faded yellow plastic tag. I pulled my hand out and tossed the metal through the air. The rusty brass keys hit the stone porch with a sharp, ringing clatter, sliding directly to a halt against the toe of Patricia's ruined designer shoe. "I paid for a one-bedroom apartment in the absolute worst part of town," I stated, looking down at them from the threshold of the grand estate. "The rent is covered for exactly 30 days. Get a job." I stepped back into the foyer and let the heavy oak doors slam shut, the final resounding thud, sealing their fate entirely. The heavy wooden doors of the federal courtroom swung shut, sealing out the noise of the press and the remaining frantic whispers of the displaced Wilson family. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, smoothing the skirt of my tailored charcoal suit. Mitchell sat beside me, meticulously arranging his legal briefs with practiced precision. Across the aisle, the defendant's table sat completely empty. Patricia and Caroline could not afford legal representation, let alone the transportation to attend the hearing. They were likely still huddled in that squalid one-bedroom apartment, facing the brutal, freezing reality of a life without credit cards. The large digital monitors mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. The video feed connected directly to the federal holding facility downtown. Richard and Desmond appeared on the split screen, and the sight was profoundly pathetic. The custom Italian silk suits, the manicured arrogance, and the aggressive posturing were entirely gone. They were wearing standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuits. Richard looked incredibly frail. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of the holding cell exposed every deep line of age and stress on his face. His skin sagged, his posture was hunched, and his eyes were completely devoid of the sharp, calculating cruelty that had defined his entire existence. Desmond sat beside him, his shoulders trembling visibly. He refused to look at the camera. He kept his eyes glued to the concrete floor of his cell, a thoroughly broken man who had finally realized his silver tongue could not talk him out of federal wire fraud and elder abuse. Judge Harrison entered the room, her gavel striking the sound block with a sharp, definitive crack. She did not waste a single second on pleasantries. She reviewed the mountain of evidence Mitchell had submitted, including the digital audio recordings from the Thanksgiving disaster and the recovered email threads detailing Patricia's corporate espionage. The judge adjusted her glasses and stared directly into the camera lens, addressing the two men on the screen. "The evidence presented before this court is not just overwhelming," Judge Harrison stated, her voice carrying absolute, undeniable authority. "It is a textbook display of systemic greed, elder abuse, and gross financial manipulation." She picked up the forged document that had started this entire war. "The secondary will, notarized under extreme duress and deliberate coercion, is hereby invalidated in its entirety." Richard closed his eyes on the monitor. He did not argue. He did not protest. He simply let his chin drop to his chest, surrendering to the crushing weight of his inevitable prison sentence. Judge Harrison turned the page of her ledger. The original testamentary trust established by Theodore Wilson, along with all attached corporate holdings and liquid assets totaling exactly $50 million, is fully restored and immediately transferred to the sole beneficiary, Madeline Wilson. I felt Mitchell nod approvingly beside me, but the judge was not finished. She leaned forward, her expression hardening into pure judicial wrath. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued her words, acting as the final nail in the Wilson family coffin. Due to the extensive, premeditated nature of the wire fraud committed by Desmond Vance and the active complicity of Richard Wilson in concealing these catastrophic losses from shareholders, severe restitution is mandated. Desmond began to shake harder, violently rocking back and forth in his plastic chair. I am ordering the immediate seizure and complete liquidation of all remaining personal assets tied to Richard and Patricia Wilson, the judge declared. This includes any offshore accounts, private retirement funds, secondary real estate properties, and personal luxury vehicles. Every single cent will be distributed to compensate the defrauded venture capitalists. Desmond let out a ragged, audible sob on the video feed. He buried his face in his shackled hands, crying like a terrified child. "You are both financially insolvent," the judge finalized, bringing her gavel down one last time. "The Wilson estate is permanently dissolved. This hearing is adjourned." The monitors clicked off instantly, severing the connection to federal holding. Just like that, the empire was officially dead. The bank accounts were drained to absolute zero. The cars were gone. The legacy was completely erased. They had spent decades desperately trying to protect their wealth by destroying me, and in doing so they had engineered their own total annihilation. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom with my head held high. The crisp afternoon air hit my face as I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped onto the expansive concrete plaza of the courthouse. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. For the first time in 30 years, I was completely unburdened. The invisible chains my parents had wrapped around my neck were shattered. Mitchell walked perfectly in step beside me. He stopped near the edge of the courthouse steps and turned to face me. He closed his battered leather briefcase and extended his hand. I reached out and shook it firmly. The grip was solid, a silent acknowledgement of a flawlessly executed strategy. "It is officially over," Mitchell said, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. "The trust is active. The accounts are in your name. You own everything, Madeline. The corporate entities, the liquid capital, the entire portfolio." He paused, looking out over the bustling city street. "Which leaves just one final piece of business. What are you going to do with the mansion?" I stood on the courthouse steps and looked out at the horizon. I thought about those sprawling marble floors, the cold, empty dining room, and the sweeping mahogany staircase where I had been humiliated, belittled, and treated like a servant for decades. I thought about Theodore and the legacy he had actually wanted to leave behind, before it was poisoned by Patricia and Richard's greed. My eyes gleamed with a sudden crystal-clear vision. I knew exactly what that massive, opulent house was destined to become. It would no longer be a monument to aristocratic arrogance or a prison for unwanted daughters. I turned to Mitchell, my smile sharpening into something bright and entirely new. "I am going to tear down the walls," I replied. The silence of my Manhattan penthouse was entirely different from the silence of the Connecticut estate. In my childhood home, silence was a weapon Patricia used to punish me for perceived slights, a heavy, suffocating blanket of continuous disapproval. Here in the home I had purchased with my own money, the silence was purely peaceful. It was the sound of absolute victory. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering skyline, holding a cup of black coffee. The psychological warfare was officially over, but I knew that healing from 30 years of relentless gaslighting and emotional abuse would not be instantaneous. The scars of being the designated family scapegoat were deep. There were still moments when I expected my phone to ring with a demanding threat from Richard or a shrill entitled complaint from Caroline. But the crushing physical weight of their expectations was permanently gone. They could no longer touch me, hurt me, or manipulate my reality. I was finally breathing clean air. The next morning, I drove my car up the winding, frost-covered roads to the Greenwood Cemetery. The winter air was brisk, leaving the manicured grass crisp and bright under the morning sun. I walked the familiar stone path until I reached the massive marble headstone bearing Theodore Wilson's name. The cemetery was completely deserted, offering the perfect undisturbed privacy I needed. I unclasped my leather briefcase and pulled out the heavy embossed folder containing the finalized court rulings, the invalidated forged will, and the irrevocable trust documents securely listing my name as the sole beneficiary. I placed the thick stack of papers gently onto the cold marble base. "It is done, Grandpa," I said, my voice steady in the quiet morning air. "They tried to bury your legacy, just like they tried to bury me. They forced a pen into your hand while you were taking your last breaths. They thought they were completely untouchable because they had the money, the expensive lawyers, and the blinding arrogance to believe they were inherently better than everyone else in the world." I reached out, resting my bare hand against the carved letters of his name. The stone was freezing, but the memory of his warmth grounded me. "But you saw right through them. You warned me when I was just a teenager that Richard was a parasite wearing a tailored suit. You told me to build my own armor and never rely on their table scraps. I did exactly what you asked. I protected what you built, and I exposed them for the greedy, vicious vultures they truly are. They have absolutely nothing left. Thank you for being the only person in that house who looked at me and saw a leader instead of a punching bag." I left the cemetery and drove straight to my corporate headquarters in the financial district. The moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors of my agency, a deafening roar of applause washed over me. My entire staff was gathered in the main lobby. Bottles of expensive champagne were already popping, and silver confetti rained down onto the polished concrete floor. My lead marketing director, Sarah, pushed through the cheering crowd and handed me a crystal flute filled with champagne. Her face was flushed with pure, unadulterated adrenaline. "We did not just win the court case," Sarah announced, her voice rising over the clapping. "We just secured the contracts, all 3 of them." I took a slow sip of the champagne, letting the sharp bubbles hit my tongue as I processed the magnitude of the news. The global tech conglomerate, the National Healthcare Network, and the international shipping firm, every single one of them, Sarah confirmed, raising her glass high. Their executive boards watched the leaked viral footage of the Thanksgiving gala. "The entire corporate world watched you systematically trap, humiliate, and dismantle 2 of the most notorious white-collar criminals in the state without ever breaking a sweat. They realized that if you possessed the strategic brilliance to orchestrate a takedown of that magnitude against your own corrupt bloodline, they absolutely needed your ruthless competence protecting their corporate interests." My agency had instantly transformed from a highly successful boutique firm into an undeniable heavy-hitting industry titan. The very event Patricia and Richard had designed to publicly humiliate me and steal my inheritance had instead served as the ultimate global advertisement for my business. I raised my glass to my team, sharing a moment of pure, unbridled triumph. After the toast, I retreated to my corner office, shutting the heavy glass door behind me to block out the sounds of the ongoing celebration. I sat down at my expansive glass desk and looked at the single document resting perfectly in the center of my leather blotter. Mitchell had couriered the paperwork over an hour ago. The header of the document was officially stamped with the seal of the Connecticut Zoning and Planning Commission. It was the municipal demolition permit for the sprawling estate where I had spent the first 2 decades of my life being treated like absolute garbage. I picked up my heavy gold fountain pen. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single ounce of nostalgia, sadness, or regret. I pressed the gold nib to the paper and signed my name with bold, sweeping strokes, legally authorizing the complete leveling of the mansion. I had already finalized the architectural blueprints for the land. I was not going to sell the acreage to another corrupt billionaire, and I certainly was not going to live in a house permanently poisoned by Patricia's cruelty and Caroline's entitlement. The heavy machinery would arrive at dawn tomorrow to tear down the marble columns, smash through the mahogany staircases, and pulverize the grand dining room where I was once told to eat in the kitchen. Once the ground was cleared and the toxic rubble was hauled away, construction would immediately begin on the Theodore Wilson Foundation for At-Risk Youth. It would be a state-of-the-art facility providing emergency housing, legal support, and educational grants for teenagers fleeing abusive households. I was going to turn the physical site of my deepest childhood trauma into a highly funded sanctuary for kids who desperately needed the exact safety net my grandfather had provided for me. I placed the cap back on my pen and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. The Wilson dynasty was officially dead-buried under the weight of its own spectacular greed. I looked out my window at the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, a self-made CEO sitting on top of an empire that nobody could ever take away from me. 6 months after the demolition of the Connecticut estate, the federal justice system delivered its final devastating blow. I sat in the front row of the courtroom flanked by Mitchell and my lead security director, as the judge read the sentencing guidelines. Richard Wilson and Desmond Vance stood side by side in matching bright orange jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that rattled loudly in the stark silence of the courtroom. The judge did not mince words. She cited their blatant lack of remorse, the sheer scale of their corporate fraud, and the abhorrent nature of their elder abuse against my grandfather. 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. When the sentence was pronounced, Richard did not shout or protest. His knees gave out, and he had to be physically supported by the bailiffs just to remain standing. The man who had spent his entire life terrorizing everyone around him, obsessed with power and legacy, had been permanently reduced to an inmate number. Desmond openly wept, begging the judge for a reduced sentence, crying that he was not built for a harsh prison environment. The guard simply hauled them both away through a side door without a second glance. Their empire of lies was officially buried behind concrete walls and razor wire. While the men of the Wilson family traded their tailored suits for prison uniforms, the women were forced to navigate a much different kind of hell, reality. Patricia Wilson, the former undisputed queen of Connecticut high society, now wears a stiff, oversized polyester uniform vest. I received a comprehensive report from my private investigators detailing her new life, and the poetic justice is breathtaking. She works 40 grueling hours a week as a front-end cashier at a massive discount retail chain on the desolate outskirts of Hartford. Her days of hosting lavish charity galas, sipping vintage champagne, and terrorizing domestic staff are permanently over. Instead, she stands behind a sticky plastic register for 8 hours a day on her aching, swollen feet. Just last week, a disgruntled customer threw a crumpled, expired coupon directly at her face because a clearance item rang up incorrectly. Patricia had to bite her tongue, pick up the piece of trash from the scuffed tile floor, and apologize profusely, absolutely terrified of losing the meager hourly wage that barely keeps a roof over her head. The profound indignity of serving the very working-class individuals she once openly despised is a daily prison sentence all its own. Caroline did not fare any better. The 30 days of prepaid rent at the rundown apartment expired exactly on schedule. Stripped of her golden child status, her stolen trust funds, and her wealthy husband, she was violently thrust into the real world. She now lives in a cramped, drafty apartment with peeling linoleum floors, water-damaged ceilings, and a radiator that constantly clanks in the dead of winter. To afford cheap groceries and basic utilities, Caroline is forced to work an exhausting minimum wage job doing tedious data entry for a local logistics company. There are no more afternoon spa days, no more designer maternity clothes, and no more servants to clean up her messes. She spends her evenings utterly exhausted counting pennies at a scratched laminate kitchen table, entirely dependent on her own unglamorous labor for survival. The harsh reality of paying her own bills has violently shattered her lifelong delusion of superiority. With the toxic remnants of my biological family permanently neutralized, I focused my entire energy on building something completely unbreakable. The demolition crew had completely leveled the Connecticut mansion, pulverizing the marble floors and mahogany staircases into dust. The toxic rubble was hauled away, leaving behind acres of pristine, cleared land. I utilized the $50 million trust left to me by Theodore, combining it with the massive profits from my own marketing agency to construct a masterpiece. Today, those grounds host the grand opening of Theodore's foundation. It is a sprawling state-of-the-art academy and resource center constructed with gleaming glass, natural wood, and bright open spaces. It stands as a beacon of hope directly on top of the soil where I once experienced profound emotional abuse. The foundation is dedicated entirely to providing free, top-tier legal representation and comprehensive career support for women escaping financial abuse and toxic family dynamics. I stood on the newly paved courtyard watching dozens of women walk through the grand entrance. They were greeted by leading attorneys, financial advisors, and career counselors whose salaries I personally guarantee. These women will never have to beg for scraps from a controlling husband or a manipulative parent. They will learn to build their own armor, secure their own capital, and forge their own absolute independence. Mitchell stood beside me watching the ribbon-cutting ceremony with a rare, genuine smile. He handed me a glass of sparkling water, nodding toward the massive brass plaque near the front doors bearing my grandfather's name. "You did exactly what he asked," Mitchell said, his voice filled with profound respect. "You protected his legacy and you created a fortress." "I built the safety net I always wished I had," I replied, taking a sip of the water. "And I made absolutely sure nobody can ever tear it down." Later that evening, I returned to my penthouse office in Manhattan. The sun was setting over the city, casting a brilliant fiery glow across the towering skyscrapers. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering, sprawling metropolis that stretched out endlessly before me. The silence in my office was pristine. There was no anxiety, no looming threat of sabotage, and no desperate need to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I had faced the absolute worst of human greed and betrayal, and I had emerged entirely victorious. I placed my hand against the cool glass of the window. I am no longer the scapegoat. I am no longer the outcast. I am no longer the victim. I am a self-made CEO. I am the sole architect of my own destiny. I am powerful, completely untouchable, and for the first time in my entire life, I am truly, unconditionally happy. The Wilson dynasty is dead. My empire has only just begun. The most profound lesson from Madeline's journey is that true healing comes from reclaiming your narrative and transforming your deepest trauma into a source of empowerment. Madeline did not merely seek revenge against her toxic family. She broke a generational cycle of abuse by dismantling their empire of greed. By turning the very estate where she was mistreated into a sanctuary for vulnerable women, she proved that the absolute best justice is building a legacy of undeniable strength and independence. Take charge of your own destiny today. Share your experiences with setting boundaries and comment below.